be innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Now, note the word meditation in the last part of that passage. When I tell people it's a good idea to meditate on the Bible, they say, I don't know how to meditate. And I respond, oh, yes, you do. Do you ever worry about anything? You're meditating on your fears. Most of us are experts at meditating, but probably meditating on the wrong things. So what do people normally think about? That's what they're meditating on. There's a lot of things. A lot of people, all they think about is money. Money, 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 money. A lot of people think and meditate all the time about sports. A lot of people about their job. There's so many people day and night, all they're thinking about is their job. A lot of people meditate about their physical appearance. I want to address briefly 4 things that people think about, they meditate about. And first, things that cause you to have anxiety, worry, and fear. About a month or so ago, I prayed with a man. He said to me, I haven't worked in over a year. We're going to lose our home. We have 2 kids in college. We don't know what to do. This past Wednesday or Thursday afternoon, some of us were out on the Redlands in a lady's kitchen praying for her. She was in a desperate situation. She showed us a stack of bills, and most of them were doctor bills for medicine. And she told us that she was threatened with losing her source of income. The fear in that home was palpable. Things like this happen again and again in our church and everywhere in these times. These are scary times, and things may get worse. If you lose your job or your source of income, they'll get worse for you in a hurry. How are you not going to think and worry about that? Several families in our church have, probably many more than I know, have sons or daughters that have been lost to the drug culture, to meth or cocaine or alcohol. Some of them don't know where their child is. They don't know if their son or daughter is alive or dead. How can a parent not lie in bed at night in an agony of worry and fear? I have a dear friend who's in the process of dying of cancer. I have friends of 45 years. Their grandson has been in the hospital for over a year with cystic fibrosis and complications. I have friends, folks in this church, who live with chronic, debilitating pain. In these times, is it realistic to expect that we can live without worry and fear? I've been spending a lot of time recently in Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, meditating about rest, because I have a tendency to worry about things. And these words are powerful from Hebrews 4, starting at verse 9. There remains a rest for the people of God, for he who has entered his rest has ceased from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent, or strive to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. The example of disobedience refers to the Jews who would not trust God and enter the land of Canaan, and they fell. They died in the wilderness. The rest of God for the Hebrews was a place, a land, the promised land. The promised land for us is a place of inner rest and peace. And God is saying to us, be diligent, strive to enter that rest. There's only a few places in the Bible where God's people are exhorted to strive, and this is one of those places. I have a a CD, a teaching by Graham Cook. Some of you know that name. And he says in this one teaching that he has come to the place that no matter what happens in his life or in the life of his loved ones or in the world, that within 15 seconds he can return to a place of rest and peace inside. Wow. If he can do that, can't we? In the past, when something upsetting would happen to my kids or grandkids or to me or whatever, usually it would take me many days to come to a place of rest inside. Nowadays, sometimes I can get there within a few minutes. Not always, but I think I'm getting better at it. So this is the question. Are we going to trust God or not? I put it to you. Does it do you any good to fret and worry and make yourself sick? Isn't your God big enough to deserve your trust? If he's not, your God is too small. You need to get rid of him and find yourself a bigger God, right? Friends, the God of this book, the true God, the living God, is big enough to trust no matter what happens. Do you know him? Do you know him in that way? Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, it says that he, Christ, destroyed him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and released those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. It's saying we don't have to fear death. Jesus rose from the grave and conquered death. So just stop for a moment. Friends, this is not church talk. This is not religious talk. This is the real deal. The Bible, God's Word, is saying to us, we don't have to fear death. If you haven't settled this in your own mind and heart, you're never going to have rest and peace because we're all going to die. I'm certainly not afraid of death. And you're probably thinking, yeah, but you've already lived long enough for two people. But if we meditate on things that cause us fear and anxiety and worry, you're going to be a miserable, fearful person. And let me tell you, that does not please God. 2 or 3 million Jews died in the wilderness because they wouldn't trust God. God was furious at them because they wouldn't trust him. You can die in the wilderness and never come to the promised land, the place of peace and rest in your heart. You must choose to trust God and meditate on his promises. What are you thinking about? Another thing that people think about, meditate on, is offenses and resentment. Wounds from the past. Usually that involves people the closest to you because they're the ones that can hurt you the most. Your father, your mother, your siblings, a step-parent, a spouse, an ex-spouse. And you know, I've counseled so many hundreds of people. If you don't forgive and be obedient to Christ, it's for us. It's for us because it will mess up your whole life if you just think about those wounds and those resentments. And there are other things that can cause people resentment. A while back, out in the lobby, a man in our church said to me, "I'm so angry, I don't know what to do." And I said, "What's going on?" Well, he had been listening to talk radio and TV. Political stuff. Have you ever seen any of that stuff? So I told him my story. A few years ago, when certain elected officials would appear on TV, I would find hatred rising up in my heart. And I says to myself, Glenn, there's something wrong with this picture. Aren't you supposed to be a Christian? Isn't your life supposed to be marked by love, even love for your enemies? These folks, they're entertainers. They make a lot of money. And they spew out left wing or right wing. It's all the same. It's criticism and character attacks and suspicion and conspiracy theories. And if you feed on that stuff, you're going to be angry. And you're going to start meditating on that stuff. Well, you might say, Glenn, aren't you concerned about our country and the course of our government? I'm terribly concerned. It's like watching a slow motion train wreck. But I've determined that my priority must be Christ. I have set my course, my goal. I fall short of it so many times. But this is my goal, to enter into Christ's rest and peace inside. I can't be useful to God in my latter years unless I'm in that place. So I challenge you to pray about this if this is a problem in your heart. Another thing that people meditate on very commonly is sexual fantasy. For men, this takes the nature of pornography. And boy, I understand it. For many years, too many years, I was hooked on pornography. It's such a trap. It's so accessible and it's so hidden. And I've read different statistics. You know, the lowest statistic I've seen is that 50% of the men in Bible churches are hooked on pornography. And I've seen as high as 70, 80%. I'm not sure if that's true, but gosh, I've counseled with a bunch of them. 2 months ago, I visited a prison in Canyon City. I have a regular prison ministry, and I was visiting Fremont, which is the largest prison, I think, in Colorado. It has 1,500 men, and someone told me that 70% of them are in prison for sexual crimes against women and children. And there are other prisons that have the same men with the same problems. There's only 50 or 60 men out of that bunch that come to the chapel and that attended the seminar I was teaching. And, you know, some of those guys that were there for sexual crimes told me they had been active in their churches. They had been officers in their churches. These are Christian men. I know guys commonly say, oh, well, I know it's not good, but it's not hurting anybody. What? As a man thinks in his heart, that's what he's becoming. Eventually, you're going to start acting out that stuff. And you know what you're becoming if you're feeding on that filth? Look at those pathetic people on the screen in their perversions. That's what you're becoming in your heart. That's what you're going to be like when you stand before God. What we take to God is our character. And let me tell you, getting older doesn't cure us of this problem, because our soul and our spirit doesn't get old. I look like an old guy, but inside I'm just 18. Seriously, that's what it feels like to you, doesn't it? However old. And that's why older people get more like they are. Some older people get gentle and kind and saintly, and some of them get as mean as a snake. They're selfish and cruel and full of lust. You're becoming what you are, friends. Be careful. It's so fast. It goes so fast. I have a newspaper article I clipped on teen pregnancy, and they made a discovery that the higher the percentage was of girls who watched certain shows on television, like Friends, that 70s show, Sex in the City, 2.5 Men, a glorification of fornication, and so forth, the higher percentage of girls that were involved in sexual activity, pregnancy, abortion, STDs. Well, duh. The things that we think about affect us. That's what we're becoming. Why do you think those companies spend all those millions on advertising? It affects us. I learned an old poem that has a lot of wisdom. Two natures live within my breast. One is foul, one is blessed. One I love, one I hate. The one I feed will predominate. What are you feeding your heart? What are you thinking about? That will predominate in your life. It will rule you. And another thing that people think about, meditate about, is self-hatred and self-condemnation. It sounds strange to say that, but it's true. I've counseled so many folks that are trapped with thoughts. Oh, I'm so stupid. I'm evil. I'm no good. I'm guilty. I'm unlovable. I'm dirty. I'm different from other people. Everything's my fault. But my parents got a divorce. It must have been my fault. Something's wrong with me. I was abused sexually. It was my fault. I'm a bad person. It's lies. And I believe I have a word for you if you're trapped in that kind of terrible, negative introspection. A word from God. God would say to you, how dare you speak evil of someone I love so much? Friends, if you're in that trap, stop it. Now, I know it's not easy. It's not just a matter of deciding. You have to work at it. I have a long teaching on this subject. I have a website that my friend John James set up for me because I'm so dumb, things like this. But it's www.glennbrownministries.com, Glenn with 2 N's. And it's chapter 14, Overcoming Self-Hatred and Self-Condemnation. See, there's some steps, there's some things you have to do to get out of this trap. And this will be an encouragement to you. I encourage you to get to work on that. Psalm 19, verse 12. Who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults. Those secret faults are the thoughts in your mind and heart. They're secret from other people. Cleanse me from those things. And verse 13, keep your servant also from presumptuous sins, that is, willful sins. May they not rule over me. Then I will be blameless, innocent of great transgression. What is a presumptuous sin? It's a sin you know is a sin, but you choose to do it anyway. It is rebellion and disobedience against God. It's defiance to God. Now, I know this is wrong, but I'm going to do it. Two people might commit the same sin, but one person does it in ignorance, while another knows very well that what he's doing is breaking God's commandments. And there's a difference when God judges those two people. When a Christian, knowing the teaching of Jesus that we must forgive others, refuses to forgive, I believe that's a presumptuous sin. I've read that between 30 and 40% of high school seniors admit to shoplifting. And they say the percentage may be higher. And many of these kids are Christians. Let me tell you, there's a difference when a kid who's pagan, and there's a bunch of them in schools and everywhere now, does something like that, and when a Christian young person does it. It's presumptuous. It's willful. When an employee, a Christian, starts stealing from his company, or when a Christian executive cooks the books in order to steal from the government or from stockholders, it's willful, it's presumptuous. And big or little, stealing is stealing. Several years ago, quite a few years ago, I borrowed a handsaw from a neighbor of mine, an old gentleman who is a widower, and he had a bunch of saws in his shop, and he loaned me a nice one, and I kept it for a long time. I kept thinking I should return that saw, but he's got a lot of them. He doesn't need it. And then we moved. I was a pastor at the time. We were moving to another church. And I saw that handsaw as we were packing. I thought, I need to return that saw. Oh, it doesn't matter. He doesn't need that. So I took it with me. So we got to our new community, and I put it on a hook in the tool shed, and something mystical happened to that saw. It got possessed. Every time I would see it, it would say, thief, thief. So I tried to ignore it, and a year or so passed, and I heard that old gentleman had died. I thought, now I'm off the hook. I went in, that saw said, thief. It didn't change a thing. So I took it down and donated it to Goodwill. And I know I've been forgiven, but I learned something in that experience. I'm not cut out for a life of crime. It just makes me miserable. So I'm talking about presumptuous sins. When Christian young people raised in church, raised in a Bible church, start cohabiting without marriage. And by the way, when Christian not so young people start doing that, that's a different proposition than for a couple raised without any Christian teaching. They're defying God. When a Christian husband or wife makes a willful decision to abandon his or her husband or wife and children, that's presumptuous. And friends, please, I didn't come to put condemnation on anyone. I know there are mitigating circumstances. I've counseled so many people that are in marriages where there's terrible abuse and cruelty and even violence. Now, this is important. People don't fall into sin like they fall into a swamp. No big sins happen suddenly. They had been thinking about it, meditating about it for a while, maybe quite a while, before they did it. Whatever a person thinks about, that is what he is becoming, or that is what he starts doing, inevitably. When an employee starts stealing from his company, or a Christian executive starts cooking the books, he had been thinking about it, rationalizing, justifying, taking little steps of compromise. When guys go postal, kill their boss, kill their fellow employees, or when there's a school shooting or a family massacre, they leave notes, they leave messages on their computer. Their anger and hatred has grown until it consumes them. They purpose to do it. It wasn't just a flight of emotion that overcame them. That pedophile in prison, before he committed incest, sometimes on their own little daughters or sons, sometimes on their little grandchildren, they had been meditating on pornography, on those perversions. And the desire, if you put it before your face in your mind, it grows and it grows and it grows until it's as if you become hypnotized. You're in a trance. You lose your freedom. You're in bondage, is what the Bible calls it. You become a slave of the devil, literally. But it didn't just happen out of the air. It happened because you had been feeding that desire, those negative thoughts, those evil thoughts, over and over until that's the person you became. when a husband leaves his wife and children. That was not a sudden impulse. He had been meditating about it, perhaps fantasizing about a new, exciting sexual relationship. And finally, he chooses to take that step. It's an act of his will, and it's a presumptuous sin and a great transgression for which he will stand before God in judgment. And by the way, some people rationalize, since Jesus said that adultery in the heart is tantamount to actual adultery, I may as well go ahead and do it. That is an insane conclusion. Then it becomes a presumptuous sin and a great transgression. God is concerned with what's in our hearts because that's what precipitates the decisions we make. But God tells us again and again to resist temptation. Is it all the same to God that a person thinks about killing someone as if he actually does it? Is it the same that you have temptations of immorality as if you start visiting prostitutes or that you commit suicide? Don't be ridiculous. So I ask again, what have you been thinking about? What do you meditate on during the day, lying in bed at night? That is what you are becoming. So what do we do about temptations that come to our mind, about negative, destructive patterns of thought that just come and they come and they come? 2 Corinthians 10:5 is talking about spiritual warfare, about strongholds in the mind. That's what we're talking about. See, a stronghold in the mind. And it says in the final verse, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. We are responsible for our thoughts. We are to bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. I have one of my ministry partners, Lynn Cumming, and I was talking to Lynn one day, and we were talking about this verse about taking every thought captive, and Lynn has a little dog named Tibbet. And she said she thinks about how she has trained her little dog when she thinks of this verse. She would take Tibbet outside and in the yard, and she'd say, "Tibbet, stay." And he would run off to smell the flowers, and she would go get him and bring him back and say, "Tibbet, stay." And a butterfly would come by, and off he would go, and she would bring him back and say, "Tibbet, stay." And she said, I must have done that 50 times before he finally started catching on. That's the way we have to do with our thoughts. Our minds, friends, are not disciplined. We have to discipline. This is work. It's Christian work. It's discipline. It's learning to be a disciple of Christ. Oh, I've been forgiven. I accepted Jesus 10 years ago, and your life hasn't changed at all? Come on. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So we go and get that thought. We go and get it, and it runs off. We have this pattern, and we do it again and again and again. But you can't think of nothing. You have to replace that with something, the negative with something positive. So now I want to teach you a poem. I learned it 40 or 50 years ago. It is a very important poem. This is the way it goes. When in a fix, Philippians 4:6. You think you can learn that? Let's try. When in a fix, Philippians 4:6. Another time, please. When in a fix, Philippians 4:6. Now, I saw 3 people that did not open their mouth. So we may be doing this for a while. We're going to try again. Loosen up out there. Let's try it again. When in a fix, Philippians 4:6. Let me tell you, this is not just a game. This scripture can save your life. So let's look at Philippians 4:6 through 8. Be anxious for nothing. I'm talking about overcoming our fears and worries. But in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving. Underline those two words.